Hey guys, Jason here for Soulfire. Today I want to bring you a book review. I want to review Dr. Juli Slattery's book, Rethinking Sexuality, God's Design and Why It Matters. So if you're involved in the church today, if you're a Christian, you know that issues of sexuality are a big deal with lots of confusion, lots of hurt, and just lots of different voices giving lots of different opinions on the matter. And so here's a recent book that touches on some of those issues. And in this review, I want to let you know what I like about the book, one concern I have for the book, and then at the end, let you know whether or not this is a resource that I would recommend for you or for your church. So let's go ahead and jump in here. The author, Juli Slattery, she is an author and teacher and clinical psychologist with over 25 years of experience. She has a ministry called Authentic Intimacy. She has a podcast. She has a number of successful books and Bible studies out there. I've actually had the opportunity to hear her speak on a few occasions, and so I am more familiar with her work. I got to be a part of getting the advanced reader copy of this book in exchange for a review, and now I'm doing a video review. Wanted to add it to my channel as well. And so let's talk about some of the things that she breaks down here in the book. So first of all, who's her audience? Who is she writing to? She says she's writing to Christians who are aware of the pain and confusion represented by sexuality, which is pretty much all Christians today in 2019. So that's her audience. She is primarily writing to Christians. And a few of the things that really stuck out to me for this book, she says, why does she want to write a book like this? Sex is taboo. And she references the evangelical purity movement, primarily in the 90s and early 2000s, which really focused on the don'ts. And it just gave a bunch of lists of rules to the younger generation of Christians, and that caused harm, that caused confusion, and that caused pain. Yet at the same time, she contrasts the purity movement to the culture, which is freely talking about sexuality. And one of the things that she talks about here in the book is that the culture has a very clear narrative on sexuality, but the church has primarily been silent, and we've approached sexuality with a bunch of no's. I've kind of referred to it as the opposite Nike campaign. It's just don't do it. That's kind of what the message that came out of the church. And so here's a quote from the book here. She says, "Our silence on sex reinforces the belief that sexuality is dirty and ungodly." And so what she wants to do in this book is advocate for sexual discipleship. And so she breaks this down into a few areas. First, know what we believe, live what we believe, and then pass on what we believe. She says the culture does a great job of passing on its beliefs on sexuality through a narrative. The cultural narrative on sexuality, she says, that it is a personal choice and that no one should limit your sexual expression. Ultimately, Christian sexuality must be submitted to the lordship of Jesus. And so that's where she's going here in this book. So here's a quote that I like that really stuck out to me. She said, "What if Christian community became known as the place to voice sexual questions, struggles, and failures?" And that's a pretty profound question, because I think today in the church, and I minister to college students, most of them did not feel free to bring up questions and issues on sexuality. Again, that goes back to the idea of taboo. So she talks about here in the premise for her book that what you think about sex ultimately begins with what you believe about God. So many issues in our culture, she says, come down to who has the authority. Is it people or is it God? And so as a Christian, and she's writing to Christians, she's going to steer us back to the scripture that it is ultimately God who has authority. So that's the premise of her argument. Then she indicates the problem. The problem is that there's someone who wants to destroy holy sexuality. That is, as the Bible describes, Satan, our adversary. And then the pandemic, she talks about that we are all sexually broken. I would say to me, that's one of my favorite parts of her book, is that she is trying to help the church to not play the Pharisee and to understand that we have got to look at ourselves and our own sexual struggles and sins and our own sexual brokenness and stop focusing on the world and their issues with sexuality. I believe that is true. I believe that's what Jesus taught, why he ramped up the law and said, hey, even if you think about someone sexually, you've committed adultery in your heart. That is our reality as sinners. The scripture makes that clear. We are all sexually broken. And then she gives the promise that Jesus has come to redeem broken sexuality. And so there's a quote here in her book that I really liked. She said, "I've never met a person whose sexual brokenness was healed or redeemed through reading a book." And so she's pointing us to that reality that is going to be in community, in the church, where we can see redemption take place. One of the main themes of the book is she details how our desire for sexuality points us to God's covenant love. So it is a narrative to push us to God's covenant love. That's kind of an interesting take. That's something that I feel like is unique to her. I haven't heard others talk about that. I've heard her talk about that in some speeches that she has given. And I would say in general, I agree with that. It's a good metaphor that she uses here. And as I summarize this review here, here's one quote that I really liked. She said, "The world doesn't need to see flawless Christians who keep God's sexual standard perfectly. What they most need to see is broken people who are no longer ashamed of their weakness, but live to brag about a God who loves them." I think that's an excellent quote. One of the things I would love to see in the church, one of the things I'm trying to help people with in this channel, is that the church is not this perfect being. We want to be pointing people to the beauty of the gospel, to the beauty of what Jesus has done for us. So the ultimate conclusion of her book is she wants to advocate for sexual discipleship. And so she says one of the main reasons we avoid sexual discipleship is that we're afraid of the mess. One of the reasons that sexuality is taboo in the church is we're really scared of, kind of what's underneath that rock if you lift it up. It's a messy thing, it's a difficult thing, and so we prefer to leave it as taboo. But one of the things I've been saying for a long time is that taboo on sexuality is just killing us in the church, and it's especially hurting our kids. And so she advocates for sexual discipleship, that we should be discipling our kids to understand God's design for sexuality. That leads me to my one critique of the book, which she actually says was on purpose. She wanted to give in this book, she said, kind of a high in the sky, in the clouds version, like a broad overview of discipleship. The challenge with that is, I wonder how many people who aren't actively discipling somebody right now will pick up a book like this, read the concepts, and say, now I feel confident to pass this on to my kids, or maybe to pass this on to somebody in my Bible study. I think one of the challenges of this book, because she chose not to be super practical on the issues of discipleship, is that many will read it and they'll get their information. They'll say, hey, I agree with that, I liked it, but it'll be hard for them to pass it on. And so maybe there can be some companion series, like a Bible study, something you could walk alongside somebody with. So I think that is my main challenge for the book. But here's where she goes with conclusion. She says if the church will address issues of sexuality, she believes it can lead to something that is nothing shorter than revival. And I totally agree with that. I love her conclusion of this book. I think one of the greatest avenues for the gospel in the church is to talk about sexuality, because that is something that goes to the core of who we are, and brokenness is our sexual brokenness in particular is going to be a wide open door for the gospel. So here's my overall recommendation. Do I think you should get this book, use it in your church, use it in a small group? Absolutely. Definitely check out her website, Authentic Intimacy. Check out her podcast, and I'd highly recommend you look into this book. Well, I hope this review was helpful. If you're interested in getting more stuff like this, click the subscribe button there and leave a comment if there's something you'd like to know about the book. Thanks so much for watching. Till the next one.